Hi everyone, Happy New Year and welcome to another video. I want to talk a little bit about the new Sony A1 II Firmware version 4. This firmware came out a few months ago, and among some other things that it improves, it also promises to improve the autofocus performance of the A1 II. The A1 II autofocus performance is already great, especially for subjects like birds in flight. But there are some improvements that Sony promised, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about this. It took me a few months to make this video because I first want to try it out in the field with different subjects under different conditions of backgrounds and light and everything, to make sure I can make a definitive statement about the improvement, if there's any improvement. Now, the new firmware brings two changes to the autofocus system. One of them is called the real-time recognition AF+, which is basically an improvement under the hood. So you don't need to go to menu or enable any settings to take advantage of that. As soon as you update the firmware, you're going to be using this new recognition AF+. And the other one is a few new focus patterns that you can use, the extra large and extra small autofocus patterns, and custom patterns that you can basically select yourself and change the size, whether you want like a wide vertical or a wide horizontal pattern. For something like a perch takeoff, for example, a wide horizontal pattern might be useful. So to take advantage of the real-time subject recognition AF+, you first have to enable the subject recognition in the autofocus menu and select the type of subject you like to photograph. I photograph birds, so I always select birds, and I don't use auto because that may recognize something else even when you're pointing it at a bird, so I always select birds. And the way I know that the camera has detected a bird is that it draws a green frame around the bird. That's how you know that it is identified that subject. So I've been shooting with this firmware for about 2 months now, and I've tried it with different subjects, mainly raptors, because these are often more difficult for the camera autofocus system to pick up from the background because they've evolved to look like the background. The colors and the feather patterns are sometimes a perfect match for the background. Something like a northern harrier against dry brush, or short-eared owls in their natural habitat. They literally look exactly like the background, and the camera often has trouble to recognize this subject when it's flying against the background. Against the sky is a piece of cake, but against the varied background, picking it up, especially when it's not super close to the camera and it's flying erratically, may be difficult. And what I've noticed is that the new firmware indeed improves the subject recognition in many situations where before the camera wasn't really detecting the bird. Now it is drawing the green frame around the bird, so I know for sure that it has detected the bird. And this improvement is real because I've been shooting the same subjects for many times before. So as soon as I go in the field and start photographing them, and I notice that, oh, the green frame is there, wasn't there before, I can tell that there is some improvement in that stability. Having said that, I wanted to point out that it's not always necessary to identify the subject as a bird for the camera to be able to focus on it. In many situations, the camera doesn't actually identify the subject as a bird, but it still grabs focus and tracks focus on it with no problem at all. And this was the case before this improvement, and now with the improvement, the camera is just more certain that it has actually picked up a bird. But what I wanted to say is that it's not like the A1 II focus was handicapped before, it wasn't good before, and now suddenly after this firmware upgrade is good. It was great before, and now it is improved on top of that. So keep that in mind as well. The Sony A1 II, or the A1 or A9 III for that matter, have two distinct type of autofocus patterns that the user can select. The down tracking autofocus patterns and the tracking autofocus patterns. And the difference between the two is a little bit confusing in the way that Sony explains it, but what it really means is that if you have chosen a tracking pattern, when you point your camera at focus at something, you will see basically a green square with two vertical green lines around it. And whatever is under that frame, the camera is going to try to track across the frame. So if that thing goes up, down, left, or right, the camera is just going to track that. That's called the tracking pattern. And as opposed to non-tracking pattern. For non-tracking pattern, basically you put the pattern on a subject and the camera just focuses on that subject. And if the subject goes away from the autofocus pattern, the camera is not going to track it. It's just going to focus on whatever it's under the autofocus pattern. So it doesn't automatically track it up, down, or left or right, wherever it is in the frame, if you're in the non-tracking pattern. But if you're in the tracking pattern, it tries to grab onto that subject that is under the focus pattern and just track that up, down, left, right, wherever it is in the focus in the frame, even if it goes outside of the originally selected pattern. So this is important to understand the difference between the tracking pattern and the non-tracking pattern. And you might ask that, why do we even need the non-tracking pattern? Why not just always use the tracking pattern? Because we just put the autofocus pattern on the bird and the camera should just track that. Well, the reason we don't always use the tracking pattern for something like birds in flight is, again, because sometimes the camera loses the subject and then it will be erratic and focus on something on the foreground or the background. But with the non-tracking pattern, the user has more control because the camera will focus on whatever you put under the autofocus pattern or the autofocus frame. You just point it, you put the subject, you either center it or you put it under the autofocus pattern and it will focus on that. So you have more control versus with the tracking, once it locks onto something, it will just take control and try to track that for you. I found that the tracking patterns work for some subjects really well. For example, if you're photographing a tern, primarily because its color is often very different from the background, like shooting terns, they're white against like blue or green or what. The camera usually does a good job with the tracking pattern. So you just pretty much like focus and grab focus and then forget, and will just track for you. More like fire and forget. But for something again like raptors, sometimes it does a good job of tracking. Sometimes it latches on the background. It depends on many different parameters. You know, what is the lighting situation? Is it too harsh? Is it soft light? Is the background close? Is the background far? But overall, I prefer to use the non-tracking pattern for raptor photography. Now, when you have subject recognition enabled, it's important to note that that takes priority. So whether you're in tracking or non-tracking autofocus pattern, if the camera detects a bird, it's gonna go for the bird and it's gonna basically draw the green frame around the bird. And as long as that happens and it correctly identifies the bird, it kind of doesn't matter whether you are in tracking or non-tracking pattern, it will just go for the bird. So if you want to use, if you feel more comfortable using tracking versus non-tracking pattern, again, it's important to recognize that we're talking about tracking and non-tracking pattern, not tracking versus non-tracking autofocus. Those are two different things. You don't want to use single shot or non-tracking autofocus. That's useless for birds in flight. But the terminology for Sony's menu nomenclature is really confusing. So I'm talking about the patterns. So if you're someone who likes to use the tracking mode patterns all the time, with this improved subject recognition, it has a lower chance of failing or latching onto something else, because most of the time it will actually recognize the bird and that takes priority and then it just goes for the bird. So that's also an improvement that I noticed. Even though I still prefer to use the non-tracking pattern for the raptors, especially when the background is very colorful or varied. But I've noticed that the subject recognition that takes priority works now better. And it does improve your keeper ratio. Again, like I said, the autofocus system for the A1 and the A1 II are both great. A1 II is a little bit better than A1. And now with these improvements, with the firmware version 4, I feel like there is more distance between the A1 and A1 II now in terms of the actual autofocus performance. Now the subject recognition is better in the A1 II with this new firmware, and also there's more flexibility in the type of the patterns that you can choose. You can have custom patterns. So with this new firmware, I feel like now there is more justification, more solid justification, that the autofocus performance of the A1 II has improved relative to the A1 for birds in flight. And another improvement, subtle but important improvement that the A1 II Firmware version 4 brings to the table is the focus distance recall feature. So I talked about this before. So with the A1 II, you can record your focus distance. You can basically program one of the custom function buttons on the camera body. I use C1 and C2 to basically record the current focus distance, and then you can quickly go back to that focus distance by just tapping the button. And this is very useful. I think I've talked about it in other videos. If you're shooting birds that are erratic and they can appear at different distances, or maybe you want to shoot two different perches at different distances, or you want to photograph birds that may pop far or close, but you don't know beforehand. By recording the focus distance, for example, you can record a short distance by pointing your camera at something a shorter distance and recording it, and then pointing it at something farther, maybe like a mountain or a hill in the distance, almost close to infinity. And recording that, you can quickly go to far or close focus so you won't miss the shot. And previously, this was only possible with prime lenses or lenses with power zoom. We don't have any lenses suitable for bird photography that are power zoom, so mostly prime lenses like 300 2.8, which I have here, the 600 f4, but it wouldn't work on the 2 to 600 or the 400 to 800 because those are zoom lenses, and it was unavailable on those lenses. But now with the new firmware version 4, you can also record the focus distance for those lenses. So if you, for example, point your lens at 10 yards away, and record that, and then you photograph something at 50 yards away, you want to come back to 10 yards, you just tap the button and it will quickly pop to that focus distance. So that's pretty handy, especially for photographing things that pop at random distances. So that's another welcome improvement in the new autofocus firmware. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the A1 II itself after almost a year of shooting with this camera. So when the A1 II first came out, there were a number of improvements relative to the A1, and I recorded a video review about that, and I shared my opinion whether I thought it was a worthy upgrade or not, and I mentioned a few areas of improvement. And now, after having photographed with this thing for almost a year, I feel like my opinion has changed a little bit actually, and now I'm even more in favor of upgrading to the A1 II because I've become used to some of its features that it's hard for me to go back now to an A1. And I just wanted to talk about those a little bit. And in terms of importance to me, obviously the pre-capture is very valuable. I find that for takeoff shots, it does make a big difference between actually taking the shot or missing it. And I've basically adapted myself to use it efficiently, because if you have it on all the time, sometimes you're grabbing and you're tracking, and when you're tracking, I usually half press my shutter to track. I don't want to take any shots because the bird is not in a favorable position yet. But as I'm tracking, this thing is buffering, and then when I'm ready to take the shot, I get like half a second at 30 frames a second, 15, 20 extra frames that I didn't really want. It fills up my card, fills up the buffer. So I don't want to have it enabled all the time. So I've programmed one of the custom buttons on the body to turn it on and off. So when I'm in a takeoff situation, I'm in a perch situation, I immediately turn pre-capture on, and then when I'm done, I immediately turn it off. So I use it efficiently. So with that, it's become even more useful, and it's a feature that it's hard to live without. The other thing that I've become used to is that the viewfinder for the A1 II and A1, they're almost similar, but the A1 II refresh rate at 120 Hz, the image quality is pretty good. For the A1, I always had to use the 240 Hz, which was a smaller image. So it has to basically, it puts a black frame around the image because it can't refresh the entire viewfinder. So you end up with a smaller image. But with the A1 II, I can still use the entire area of the viewfinder at 120 Hz. The quality is not that bad at all. With the A1, I think 120 Hz the resolution dropped so much that it was a little bit unpleasing to the eye when you were using it. So I rather use that 240 Hertz. But with this one, I used the entire viewfinder area at 120 Hertz. The quality is still lower than 60 Hertz. And when you half press to track, you can see a little bit of reduction or degradation in quality. But overall, the 120 Hertz full area of the finder works for me, and I like it a lot more than the 240 Hertz in the A1, because although it was faster, the area was much smaller. So the image in the viewfinder was much smaller, and it kind of looked like those older mirrorless cameras where the viewfinders were kind of small. But with this one, I used 120 Hertz. It's still fast enough for all the action that I want to do, and the quality is pretty good. So it feels like a larger, in practice for this particular application, birds in flight, for me, it feels like actually a larger viewfinder because I'm able to use the 120 Hertz mode. That's another improvement. And another improvement that I find very valuable is not for birds in flight, but it's mostly for perch birds in low light. And the image stabilizer, the in-body stabilizer in the A1 II is much better than the A1. So I've been experimenting with slow shutter speeds. There's some samples here that you can see. I've been routinely successful in making sharp images with these super telephoto lenses, let's say like 600 millimeters and longer at something like 1/150th of a second, 1/1/200th of a second. Before with the A1, same lenses, it was a struggle. You could get sharp shots, but you had to take like 100 shots and then maybe a couple of them were sharp. But with this one, the stabilizer, in-body stabilizer, has improved quite a bit. So a lot of those slow shutter speed shots are pretty tack sharp. And that helps when the light is really, really low and you just want to take some perch shots and you want to drop your shutter speed. This one can take it. And I think that improvement itself is actually something that I didn't think of much at the beginning, but now I've become used to it. So overall, with these improvements, including pre-capture, more robust autofocus performance, more configurable autofocus performance, better quality viewfinder at 120 Hertz, and much more effective in-body stabilizer, I feel like the A1 II is actually more appealing as an upgrade to A1 than I had first thought about. So I think now it's like a much more solid recommendation for me to go from A1 to A1 II. If you haven't already done that, you may want to consider that. Most recently, I've been using this combo, the A1 Mark II with the 300-2.8 with a 2x converter to photograph short-eared owls, and this was a very low light situation, so ISOs were high, 3200, 4000 and higher, and the performance was quite good. The autofocus tracking in that low contrast situation, especially the bird, is almost like indistinguishable with the background. It was pretty good. And the sharpness and everything is good, so I was able to make some good looking files even though the light was low and the ISO was very high. Overall, the image sensor in this thing is pretty good in terms of quality, and it's a great balance between sharpness, detail, and the high ISO performance. I also photographed some barn owls earlier, which I had to go to really high ISO, and it actually exceeded my expectation. I tried to not really shoot when you need more than 3200 ISO, just because the image is just gonna look a little murky and lacking in details. But with this one, I believe I went all the way up to like 8000, and I have some good files even at 8000. But yeah, I mean, the bird has to be certain plumage. You know, you want a bright kind of light colored bird. It wouldn't work for all the subjects, but overall it was pretty good, and I've been quite happy with this combo. And with that, thank you very much for watching the video. If you like these videos, remember to click the subscribe button so you receive a notification whenever a new video is uploaded.